All right, this is going to be a short video on John Stuart Mill. I'd like to say just a few words about him and about his life. He was British, lived from 1806 to 1873. He was a member of the British Parliament, and he actually played a role in keeping Great Britain out of the Civil War that we had, of course, between 1861 and 1865. His work is important in several different areas, in political philosophy, but also in theory of knowledge, in ethics, and he wrote a text that was important in getting women the right to vote. He did different things. Um, Now, his main doctrine is that of utilitarianism, which is the idea that you should act so as to maximize the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, taking into account not merely one's individual happiness, but actually the happiness of all of sentient creation. The principle of utility is one of the famous ethical principles that we talk about and use, consider very frequently in ethics. Um, Now, let me say a few words about his life. He had a very interesting life. His father, named James Mill, was also a philosopher. That's pretty rare that both father and son are philosophers. And he actually was educated as a child by both his father and by another famous philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Um, when he became an adult, he initially did not go into philosophy. In fact, he went into business and he got a job at the British East India Company. He moved up through the company till he became one of the directors of the company. Now, this was a massive company. In one of the worst forms of colonialism, actually, it controlled Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as India, essentially as if this country, this whole massive area, was in fact merely should be run by a company, essentially because they had exclusive trading rights. They more or less called the shots. In 1858, the British Crown dissolved the British East India Company and attached India to the British Crown as a colony. And it was after that point that John Stuart Mill entered philosophy and had a spill in the British Parliament. A quick note on the words liberty and freedom. In the United States, we tend to use freedom a bit more often, but in point of fact, they are synonyms. It's a bit of a pity because we have two different meanings. We can talk about political liberty, and we can talk about liberty in a metaphysical sense relating to free will. It's a pity we don't separate the two words, use one for one and one for the other, but in fact we use both for both. All right, and here, of course, we're talking about political liberty. If you prefer to use the word political freedom, that works just fine. It's not there's not a real distinction there. Now, that notion of liberty is a little bit delicate. When we talk about liberty today and liberalism, unfortunately, the meaning has shifted. For John Stuart Mill, as for even today the Canadians, the Australians, and the British, liberalism is the political doctrine where you basically intervene in government only insofar as to create equality of opportunity. You are not concerned with equality of outcome. You let people make their own choices, their own mistakes, and so outcomes can become very different. That's okay for liberalism, provided people have had a similar opportunity at the start, at the get-go, at the start. So you have a strong rule of law. You're willing to change and modify society with the goal of creating this equality of opportunity. It tends to be a small government with minimal intervention if it's inspired by classical liberalism. In the United States, the word, under the force of history, has changed considerably. What happened briefly is it became attached to the Democratic Party in the 19th century when the Democratic Party was the Liberal Party. Under the force of history of World War I, the Depression, World War II, the Democratic Party shifted its politics to become much more active in big government more the party of big government, which previously had been the Republican Party. So basically, the party shifted sides of shifted their policies almost in a circle. But the word liberalism stuck to the Democratic Party, so the meaning came to be very different from what it was initially. So when I talk about liberalism with Mill, and sometimes in political philosophy, you have to be careful if we're using it in the classical sense or in the modern American sense. All right. I talk a little bit about Montesquieu in the notes. I should mention briefly, Montesquieu is a real favorite philosopher. I get a kick out of his influence at the Constitutional Convention. I noted when I was working on a paper about the Constitutional Convention that they never simply say Montesquieu. They always have an adjective in front of his name. The Great Montesquieu, the fantastic Montesquieu. They always have these praise words in front of him. Now, I hope you give a shot at looking at the selective intention video. I find that to be really quite extraordinary. It does show, that, of course, that our attention span is much more limited than we think. People who are able to focus typically only on one thing, not two. So the idea of multitasking is frequently nothing more than a fantasy. The reality is, if you can do something well, you can't do two things well. So if you're not paying attention, well, then you can do something else, but you're not doing anything well. You're not doing either task well. But if you have good focus, you tend to only be able to do one thing at a time. I wanted to talk here on the video because it was very careful about, I have to word it carefully, about a case that I find interesting about our drug laws and John Stuart Mill's liberty principle, which I hope at this time you've gone through and understood. The case that I want to talk about is an American doctor named William Halsted. You may not have heard of him, but he developed aseptic surgery. He made the United States in the 19th century was behind the British, the French, and the Germans. But in the late 19th century, with the medical school of Johns Hopkins, the Americans began to catch up. And one of the first surgeon at Johns Hopkins was William Halsted. He trained 17 chief residents while he was their professor of surgery, who went on to train 136, who went on to train the entire next generation. And even today, actually, most surgeons know how many generations removed they are from William Halsted. He basically trained all American doctors who are alive today if you go back through the generations. So it's aseptic surgery, rubber gloves. It sounds like he was a great hero, and he did do wonderful things. He really put American medicine on the map and took us from being behind the Western European countries to right at the forefront. And he was addicted to cocaine and then morphine. These were being used as painkillers. He managed to get addicted to one, and then he got addicted to cocaine first, then he cleared his cocaine addiction, then he got addicted to morphine. If you know the life of William Halsted, you really hate drugs. They harmed his life tremendously. They did a terrible, terrible thing to his life. He struggled. He wasn't a happy man. In many ways, he sometimes had to stop his brilliant work to recover, to go into basically what we call rehab today. It gave him difficulties in his private life. The drugs were just awful in their effect on him, both cocaine and morphine. Nonetheless, he led an extremely productive life. I mean, he is the greatest surgeon probably in the history of surgery, and not just in the United States, but probably in the entire world, despite the drug addiction. So I find two things kind of perverse here that we have to learn to wrap our heads around with the liberty principle when you think about the life of Halsted. One, of course, this behavior was very harmful to him. So we want to do something to stop people from using drugs when we see the tremendous harm it did to Halsted. So he managed to overcome it enough to do something incredible, but he would have done even more had he not been struggling with his drug addictions throughout a lot of his life. And eventually morphine did pretty much destroy his life at the end. He lived to 70, but at the last years of his life, he was no longer productive. But the second, if we had made drugs illegal like we did in the 20th century, Halstead just would have been picked up as a drug addict, would have been thrown in prison, and he would not have had this productive life. So it's that difficult space of thinking about something being bad, harmful, something you want to protect people from, without necessarily arguing that it should be illegal. All right. So we have to keep those a little bit separate, and we'll think about those as we go through the liberty principle. I hope you enjoy reading John Stuart Mill. I think he's a wonderful read.